Hi, everyone. So my keystone project is a podcast called Specto, Ergo Sum. That's Latin for I watch, therefore I am. And this is a podcast where I take topics from philosophy and use episodes of contemporary television shows as case studies to kind of work out my own solutions to some of these issues. Oh, and there is my real title slide. So my motivation for this project was kind of twofold. First, I noticed that there are some really prevalent misconceptions about both philosophy and television in common understanding. As someone who studied philosophy for 4 years, I now have a greater appreciation for it, but I know before I decided to take this on as a second major, I kind of had this image of philosophy as something very abstract and removed from concerns of everyday life, even elitist. And TV sort of has the opposite image problem. That picture on the bottom that's Robert Mino. He was the chair of the Federal Communications Commission in the 50s, and he gave this famous speech where he described television as a vast wasteland. And I think, we do talk about the golden age of television now, but there's still a fair amount of stigma attached to, television as something unhealthy or just mindless entertainment. And I don't think that really does the medium justice. So my solution was to pair topics from philosophy with television shows that deal with similar themes to kind of bring out the best in both disciplines. And another reason why I thought this might be a good combination of approaches is there's a rich tradition in philosophy of using fictional narratives as case studies for sort of figuring out how cultures come to their own conclusions about these long-standing questions of identity and the nature of reality. And anyway, since television is kind of our culture's dominant storytelling medium right now, it seemed like a good fit and a good new angle to take on a lot of these philosophical problems. So I produced 5 episodes in total, and for each episode I started with a literature review. So I just did a lot of research on kind of the foundational texts of each topic I was considering. Then I interviewed someone from the BU philosophy department who specialized in that area. And then I did a close reading of my TV show case study to kind of draw out some similar themes. And finally, I tried to propose my own tentative solution to these questions that have been debated for centuries. So my first episode was called Aristotelian Horror Story, and I tried to apply Aristotle's Poetics. That's Aristotle. So the Poetics is a text where Aristotle talks about tragic drama and both how to write a good tragedy and what the intended audience effect should be. And that second part is what I was interested in because I wanted to see if his concept of catharsis as a response to tragic emotions in fiction would also explain why we enjoy the horror genre, as seen on American Horror Story. And this topic was a lot of fun to research, and I kept finding so many opinions on it, especially in contemporary philosophy and philosophy of film, that I recorded a follow-up episode with some more contemporary perspectives on this debate. My second episode was all about personal identity, and to kind of build my philosophy foundation, I picked 3 of the better-known perspectives on personal identity. So René Descartes, David Hume, and John Locke, each of whom has their own explanation for what makes you you and what role consciousness has to play in constructing your personal identity over time. And then I put them in conversation with an episode of Black Mirror, which is a sci-fi show on Netflix. And this particular episode dealt with artificial intelligence and consciousness cloning and a lot of issues that are very relevant to the topic of personal identity. So I basically went philosopher by philosopher and said, okay, would Descartes consider this android clone a real person? What does that thing's identity consist of? And just trying to bring these older perspectives into a sci-fi situation. My third episode was about the philosophy of the emotions, specifically sympathy and empathy. So Peter Goldie was a more contemporary philosopher. He was one of my sources for this. And Adam Smith, who's better known for his writings on economics, but he also has this book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments that talks a lot about sympathy and empathy. And so I wanted to look at what does it mean to sympathize or empathize with a fictional character, especially an anti-hero like Tony Soprano, and can we have these feelings of sympathy or identification and still disapprove of his actions from a moral standpoint? So what's the moral content of these emotions? My final episode was a little bit of a detour into analytic philosophy. I talked about what kinds of definitions philosophers use in argumentation, and it turns out they're a little different than dictionary definitions. They have to serve different purposes. And I ran into some trouble trying to come up with a traditional set of necessary and sufficient conditions for what makes something television. So I considered an alternative. This is Ludwig Wittgenstein. He's a 20th century philosopher who kind of pioneered this concept of family resemblance categories instead of traditional definitions. It's a lot to explain in 2 minutes, but it's basically an alternative to listing all the conditions for what makes something an instance of this term, and instead you build a category of related instances that can evolve as the term is deployed in future iterations. And so I tried to come up with my own family resemblance definition of television, and I used it to combine 4 very different television shows, including Real Housewives of New York, Documentary Now, Orange is the New Black, and Twin Peaks. And could these all cohere together in this category, television? So why is this important? We don't have a podcast shortage in the world, but I do think that listening to this podcast, you become a more discerning viewer of television. You have these long-standing philosophical issues in the back of your mind, and you can really draw out your own conclusions based on your responses to television entertainment. And I also hope that this podcast has made philosophy feel more accessible and relevant to everyday life. And again, because television is such a powerful storytelling medium, I think it gives us a really unique opportunity to look at how we as a culture of storytellers consider these philosophical issues. So here's a recording of me talking instead of me talking in person.
As you know from these plays, they're extraordinarily painful. You would ask yourself at the end, why would anybody want to go see this?
Fake Ash has the same memories as the real Ash, but that evidently isn't enough to make him exactly identical.
Right. Why, this is a fictional character. How can you be feeling this? It's irrational to feel these things for a non-entity. Right, okay. That seems to get a lot wrong. Right?
And it's also important to keep in mind that the viewer is an active participant in meaning making. I really don't believe that we're being brainwashed by our entertainment like Plato and others might fear.
We could have a cord or a rope that corresponds to the life of a concept as we deploy it through time. But there might not be one single thread that extends the length of the cord.
I think we do feel pity and fear for her. Pity because she doesn't deserve to be trapped in a serial killer's basement. I don't think anyone does, but her especially because we sort of identify with her.
So, for example, one of the plot types that Aristotle rules out as not leading to fear and pity is when someone who is vicious falls into affliction. No fear and pity, right? Because you just smiled.
Right.
let the transcript show that Claire Jennings just smiled. Yeah, we do.
That's all I need.
That's all you need. Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, we don't get to talk about TV.
We can if you want. So I can take a couple questions now. Yes.
Where could I find your podcast?
Great question. Right now, I am still in the process of putting the last 2 episodes up online, but it'll be spectoergosum.tumblr.com and coming to iTunes near you shortly. What's the next step? Anyone else? All right. Thank you.